Welcome. I'm Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, The United Kingdom of Israel, Foreshadowing the Reign of Christ the King. Today we'll be talking about Lesson 5 of our study, which covers the first book of Samuel, chapters 16 and 17. Where we left off, Samuel and Saul have had an irreconcilable falling out. Namely, Samuel wants to love and serve God, and Saul doesn't. And Samuel feels especially bad about this because he's the one who made Saul king. And so we see here at the beginning of this section, he's pretty much non-consolable at this point because he feels like he did a bad thing to the people that he cares about, even though, if you recall, he warned them that it was a bad thing, told them that bad things would happen, and then they did, and he still feels bad about it. He's not feeling, I told you so, you all deserve this. He instead, because again, a prophet is somebody who feels about things the way God does, just feels sorry for them, even though he certainly did everything he could to keep that from happening. So, we're winding down the import of Saul, who God did choose as king, and if you remember, he was decent in the beginning, and he'll be king for a while, depending on how you interpret who's king. But God has decided, okay, first we'll do it because you just want to be like everybody else. We'll give you the kind of king that everybody else would want. Now, when that hasn't worked out, we're going to try a slightly different approach. So, God says to Samuel, yeah, I know you're bummed about this, but why? We're just going to move on. Get up, grab some oil, and let's go. And Samuel, being the appropriate follower of God, is willing, but says, yeah, remember that Saul guy? If he hears I'm going around trying to find another king to anoint, he's going to kill me. What can we do about that? I'm not doing it, I'm not willing, just how do we deal with this, God? And God says, just say you're doing something else, which is an interesting response from God when you think about lying. Is God lying? Or is God asking Samuel to lie? Turns out, no, because once God says, no, you should just tell people you're here to offer a sacrifice, then he is. He's definitely going to offer a sacrifice while he's there. It is not a false statement. It is not the whole truth, but God is not asking Samuel to lie. Big important difference. St. Augustine defines a lie as a false statement told with the intention to deceive. Where it can seem like Samuel is lying here is he's definitely intending to deceive people because he doesn't want to be murdered by Saul. But he does not say anything false when he says, I'm here to offer a sacrifice, because at the point that God tells him that, he's like, yes, I am going to go and offer a sacrifice. It is a true statement. So, Samuel, not lying. So, he shows up in Bethlehem, which is in the land of Judah, and the guy that he is going to see is from the tribe of Judah. Shows up, and people's first response, if you remember, the last thing we've seen Samuel do was grab a sword and cut a king's head off. So his reputation has clearly preceded him. People think that he is there. They don't know why he's there, but they're nervous about it. So they want to make sure that he comes in peace. So that is their question, and he says, yeah, I'm just here to offer a sacrifice. When we last left Samuel, he had come into town on a ruse, if not a lie, wherein he says, I'm here to offer a sacrifice. Everybody here in Bethlehem, you should all come. And so almost everybody in town shows up. And pointed out to Samuel is Jesse and his 7 sons who are there. And God says, yeah, that's the guy. We want one of his sons. So when everybody's there around the sacrifice, Samuel is paying special attention and wants to meet all of Jesse's sons. and he meets the first one and says, "This guy is tall and handsome. This is our king, right, God?" And God says, "Samuel, have you learned nothing? That is not how we choose kings now. We don't care how handsome they are, except the guy we choose is also going to be very handsome, but let's not worry about that. That's not how we do things. We choose, you see whether somebody is handsome or not, I see their heart. That's what we're going to do this time. We're going to choose a guy with a handsome heart." And actually, who loves and fears and serves God. Because we saw how the previous thing worked. It's actually, in light of that, a little odd that Samuel still is thinking, well, that one didn't work out, but we'll choose another one and we'll use the same criteria. But, again, God's point, God does not see as men do. First son, no go. No matter how handsome, doesn't get to be king. 6 more sons are paraded by, and in every other case, it's not that one. So then, at God's prompting, Samuel says, "Is that all the sons you have?" Jesse says, "Well, there's the guy who's, off with the sheep, I guess, the youngest." And Samuel says, "Cool. We're all going to just stand here until he comes, so you should bring him." David comes, he is healthy looking, he's handsome, he has beautiful eyes, and God says, "That's my guy." But again, it is incidental and coincidental that David happens to be good looking, although I'm sure it helps with some of his relationships with other people. The big thing here is that he loves and serves God. He's the youngest, he's off with the sheep. He's not even important enough to be invited to the sacrifice everyone's going to. But he is God's guy. So right there, on the spot, Samuel pulls out his horn of oil and anoints David as king. And if you remember back to Saul's kingship, it happened in 2 phases. He was anointed first by Samuel, which is what made him king in God's eyes. And then to be king in the people's eyes, he was chosen by lots later. And that's what actually created the office and gave him the power. But from the beginning, we see there's just a difference between being king in God's eyes and being king in the people's eyes. And so from this moment on, as far as God is concerned, David is the king. So there's a new king. He has been anointed by Samuel. David has. And the Spirit of the Lord has rushed upon David. And we see this gift of the Spirit. If you remember back to when Saul was called, the Spirit of the Lord and anointed, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him and he was a new man. So now we see the Spirit of the Lord has come upon David, who doesn't need to be a new man because God chose one he liked the way he was. So David was already a man after God's own heart, although we haven't quite gotten to that part, but spoiler, David is a man after God's own heart. But God's Spirit on David, turns out God only gives his Spirit to one king at a time. There's a new king, so his Spirit departs from Saul, who presumably then goes back to being the old man. Although he already has fallen far enough, you wouldn't know the difference. And in place of the Spirit of God comes an evil spirit that torments Saul. And the sycophants he's gathered around him, in their desire to please the king, make a suggestion. "Hey Saul, just find somebody to play some music and you'll be good. It'll soothe and calm you." And Saul says, "Sure, whatever, yeah, do that. That sounds fine. Just go do it." And they do, and they find and recommend David, who is described using many favorable terms as pretty much the best guy ever. And Saul says, "Yep, that sounds good. Bring him here. We'll do that." He wants David to enter into his service. His dad sends him with gifts for the king. It's not enough to give him your only son, but you load him up with some farm produce as well and send him along with those as well. So David shows up. Saul likes him a lot. Again, David also handsome. and extremely charming and personable. It's not very surprising. And he has, along with all of his previous very good traits, he has the benefit of being God's anointed as well. And Saul, whether he knows what he's seeing or not, having been God's previously anointed king, may very well, if not consciously, recognize and appreciate that in David when he sees him. And it turns out that David has the ability to calm the evil spirit in Saul when he plays music, and so they get on very well, and Saul is a big fan of David's at first. So, we left off with David entering into the service of Saul. And now we see, in an oddity of this book that's worth addressing here, and we'll see come up as we continue throughout this lesson, Book of Samuel is compiled from multiple sources. So now we're going to kind of go back in time and tell a different version of the meeting of David and Saul. And this one also portrays David in a very favorable light. It's not worth overly dwelling on the fact that there are some contradictions here. The important thing to focus on is we get to see and learn more about who is Saul and who is David, especially in this instance, who is David. But for right now, we're going to focus on a Philistine named Goliath. So, armies gather together. Everybody draws up on their lines. They're not fighting yet. Out steps a very big, tall, strong-looking Philistine who mocks and challenges the Israelites, specifically to individual combat, and says, if any of you can beat me, then we'll all be your servants. Fingers crossed behind his back. Like, no, not really, but that's not going to happen anyway, so whatever. Come at me, and if not, then all of you need to be our servants. One-on-one combat is the challenge. And the Israelites and Saul, brave as they are, have no interest in engaging in that particular challenge. Which, a lot bigger than you, unless the situation has been fixed. None of the Israelites have decent weapons. He definitely does, and is well armored. And again, big and strong. You can see why nobody wants to go on a suicide mission just for the sake of the Israelites. Although they certainly have some strong and brave people, but nobody is biting at this point. So we left off with Goliath issuing a challenge, the Israelites not being really very interested in engaging. We learn in this section that 3 of David's brothers are in Saul's army. And there are a couple of very interesting numbers in this section. First of all, it's worth noting, David is the 8th son. Without going into too much detail, and you can find a lot more on this on our website and in our written studies, 8 is a number of completion and perfection in the Bible. Usually when you see a 7, it ends up being something that's pointing towards something else yet to come. 8 is not that way. 8 is the thing you've been waiting for. And David is the 8th son, is the king that is the real king, that is the one we've been waiting for, that is the one we want, is the foreshadowing of Christ, who is obviously the super real king and the king forever and all of that. But David is the 8th son, is the model of a king for the duration of the people of Israel, and still is to this day the model of the way Christ himself is the king. So, armies have been gathered together for a long time, lined up against one another. It's been 40 days that Goliath has been coming out, making this challenge. 40 days is in the Bible a number of trial, of suffering, of periods like that. 40 years wandering in the wilderness. Lent is 40 days. Jesus was tempted by the devil for 40 days. It's a number suggesting such incidents. And it's been 40 days that Goliath has been taunting the people, although it doesn't explicitly say there's always taunting, but we saw he came out and nobody's fighting, so you can guess that it's fair to assume every day Goliath in all of his armor is coming out and saying, will any of you cowards fight me? And that's what's putting off the battle. So David is sent to provide provisions for his brothers who are in Saul's army. So after 40 days, he enters the scene. So we've been setting the scene. We've seen armies arrayed against each other. Goliath the Philistine, big strong guy coming out, challenging the Israelites presumably every day, and nothing happening for 40 days. But now, in addition, we said another part of the scene. New guy enters. Jesse sends David to his brothers, who are in three of his brothers are in the fight. It keeps talking about how they're fighting, but they're just lining up against one another, and Goliath comes out and the Israelites cower and no fighting seems to be happening. But fighting. At any rate, his brothers are there and he's bringing them provisions, so David enters the scene. And he sees it so happens that as soon as he gets there and finds his brothers, the daily ritual occurs. Goliath comes out. He's taunting everybody. Everybody is afraid. And David seems maybe understandably perplexed by this. What gives, everybody? You all seem afraid of this. So he digs into it a little bit more. Specifically, David's attitude is very clearly, who is this uncircumcised heathen compared to the armies of the living God? If God is on your side, who can be against you? I don't understand why all of you seem so scared of this. You have God on your side. But David, as we continue to learn, as an extremely gifted leader and administrator, is not stupid. And so decides, it reads like he's already decided, if none of you are going to do it, I'm going to go kill this guy because he's bringing shame to all of us. But just to clear things up a little bit, maybe get it in writing first, what does the guy who do this get? Because, I'm doing it anyway, but what are you going to give me when I do, since you're all so scared? If you're good at something, never do it for free. And what you get is wealth, marry the daughter of the king. If your family is in servitude, slavery is a temporary institution anyway in Israel that resets every 50 years or so. But if your family happens to be in a period of slavery, then king will just make that go away. It's a pretty good deal. So David seems to have on his mind that it wouldn't be such a bad thing to just go take care of this problem. David, as he is inquiring about what's in it for him when he does what he seems to have in mind, his brother, knowing him well, figures out what he's planning and says, "What are you doing anyway, David? Aren't you supposed to be with the sheep?" Remember, Dad told David to come. It's not like he's doing anything inappropriate, but there's a little sibling rivalry going on here. Three of David's brothers have been there the whole time, and none of them has stepped up to the challenge. They've followed the example of the people, which likely means they're also afraid and intimidated by Goliath. And here's David, who's like, yeah, I kind of think I might want to go kill him. So anyway, there's a little spat, but no big deal, I'm sure, between brothers. So David goes his separate way and repeats the question. What does the guy who kills this guy get? And it sounds from what happens like he's pretty much going around the camp making sure there's a pretty consistent answer. David seems fairly convinced that he's going to do this. So, it seems like this is where we get the idea that it sounds like David has pretty much been asking anybody who will listen to him, what does the guy who kills Goliath get? Because it spreads around enough that Saul catches wind of it, and Saul, being both an opportunist and himself afraid to go fight Goliath, says, "Bring to me this guy who thinks he can do this." So they bring him David, and Saul is initially underwhelmed. He's not big and strong like Goliath. He doesn't have the same... Saul's point is, and this guy's been fighting since he was very young, clearly very successfully. You're a shepherd, so why am I going to send you? Because if you lose, you embarrass all of us. And per the terms of the agreement, which is not actually an agreement, but just what's been said, then we all have to be their servants if you lose. So why am I going to stake this whole thing on you? To which David has a pretty decent answer in two parts. First of all, yes, I'm a shepherd, but you know what attacks sheep? Lions and bears. Oh my. And I've managed to fight all of them off and kill any lions and bears that get in the way. And what is A, this guy isn't a bear, can't be that hard, and second, he's defied God. So it really doesn't matter who I am or what I can do, because God's going to be fighting for me, not me. And then how can I possibly lose? So I don't understand what your concern is here. It's like, God's doing this. It's like, David almost seems legitimately confused by the concern and doubt of everybody here. He's just so confident that God cannot let the insult stand and will deliver victory into the hands of whoever undertakes to fight the guy, that he's just sure. Yeah, God let me kill all those lions and bears, so what's the big deal about one Philistine? I'm going to win. So Saul is sufficiently persuaded by the argument to let him try. He gives him his armor and his sword, which David initially straps on. You know, he is not unambitious, even though he is definitely also fighting on behalf of the Lord. It's not unuseful to be confident in God's victory and take advantage of it. He's certainly very much just serving God, but he understands, because he's not dumb, that there's also a lot to be gained personally here by carrying out the will of God. So initially, nice status thing, you're wearing the armor of the king, no problem, but he very quickly changes his mind when he realizes he can't move, because he's not used to wearing armor, and instead says, Saul, you know, it's great you want to give me your armor, I just need these 5 rocks. So he grabs 5 rocks and off he goes. So David has the king's blessing to go try to take on Goliath. And as you would see in a good action movie, before we get to the physical violence, we have a little verbal sparring as well. So Goliath mocks David for his size, for the fact that he just has basically shepherd stuff, and a stick, he says, and we know a sling, because that becomes important very presently here. Not armor, not sword, not spear, not javelin, and the Philistine proceeds to curse David by his gods, which of course David's not going to care about because David doesn't believe in those gods. So that would be the opening volley from Goliath, to which David responds, yeah, I don't need those things, I have God. And so who cares? You're armed with your armor and your sword and your spear and your javelin. That's great. I have unlike your gods, I have the living God, the God of hosts, who's on my side. So it doesn't matter. I'm going to win. And everybody here is going to see it, and they're going to know that God doesn't need swords to win battles. You do. God doesn't. So I'll just show you and everybody, well, not you because you'll be dead, but I'll show all the people in my army on my side who have been so afraid of your sword and your armor and your spear and your javelin and your size that doesn't matter when you have God on your side. We've gotten through the round of the battle that is the verbal sparring match. So far, David is winning. And we get almost immediately into the battle, which is, it's a good thing there was some build-up because the battle itself is incredibly short. David pulls out one of his rocks, puts it in his sling, launches it, and the battle is over immediately. So anybody who is worried about David or any of that, it takes all of 30 seconds or less for David to handily dispatch Goliath. He goes over, draws Goliath's own sword, and cuts his head off and carries it around. Victory David. All of the Philistines are then panicking when this unarmed young shepherd has killed their champion, and look at all these guys who are armed who are standing right there, and if everything goes like, they're forgetting the 40 days they were too afraid to fight and are suddenly panicking. And now the Israelites are forgetting that they were afraid to fight without that big guy intimidating all of them, and they rush on as the Philistines are fleeing, and again, victory Israel. So far, so good. Then we get to what is, and we talked about it a little earlier, but now we get to a weird part in the text. Won't dwell on too much. David takes the head to Jerusalem, which is not yet Israelite territory. A little weird, and then you see right away he's still carrying it around. And you also see Saul doesn't seem to know who he is, and says to Abner, "Who's that guy?" And Abner says, "I don't know." And so David gets to meet the king, whom it seems like he doesn't know. So, little odd. Important part, either way, whether it's by playing the harp or the lyre and soothing Saul when the evil spirit is tormenting him, or whether it's he kills Goliath and helps Israel win a great victory. Either way, he gets to know the king. And David, awesome. Saul, maintaining the status quo. This has been an overview of Lesson 5 of the Turning to God's Word Bible Study, The United Kingdom of Israel, Foreshadowing the Reign of Christ the King. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.